Welcome everyone to this episode 16 of Salud y Querencia. These are the Health Equity Council's critical casual conversations about health equity, health policy, and all things relevant to communities of color in the state of New Mexico and globally. So we want to thank you for joining us this evening and being here. We have a very special guest. But first, I'd like to just introduce Querencia and the concept and idea of this show and thinking through Querencia and Salud and health, and Querencia being our home and our stronghold within our communities and our community capital and all things. So these conversations are for you, everyone that's joining us on Facebook or on Zoom. You are so welcome to join this conversation. This is for you. Querencia. I am Dr. Carmela Roybal, and this is Diana Lopez. We are your co-hosts, and we are here at the Health Equity Council, situated in Bernalillo County. We're in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We are funded by the New Mexico Alliance of Health Councils and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And again, the Health Equity Council is a community-based nonprofit in Albuquerque, serving the larger metro area and all of Bernalillo County. And I'm going to go ahead and give it to you to introduce our topic tonight, Diana.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Roybal. Really excited to be here and really excited to have a wonderful guest with us this evening. First of all, let me introduce our topic. This evening, we're going to be talking about migración and health. We're going to talk about health processes and coping mechanisms related to migration, with a particular focus on a global perspective, dispersed families, and we're going to explore health processes that migrants undergo during their journey. We're also going to gain a better understanding of health outcomes that is associated with migration. And additionally, and most importantly, we're going to delve a little deeper into the reasons behind outcomes and underlying causes at play. Without last but not least, we just want to jump into introducing our wonderful guest we have with us tonight, Ms. Roberta Villalon. And Dr. Roberta is a professor of sociology and is dedicated to promoting justice across geographical and social boundaries through activism. Her expertise in political science, international relations, and Latin America has greatly influenced her transitional feminist perspective. She's an accomplished author, having written extensively on topics like migration, health, inequities, violence, social movements, and justice. And Roberta, I will hand it right over to you.
Well, buenas noches. Thank you very much for having me here. It's my pleasure to be, at least virtually, but together with all of you, sharing a little bit of the knowledge that I've been able to gather together with different migrant communities in Latin America and people who had moved and lived for years in the United States and in different countries in Europe, and then moved back to Latin America. And I love the essence of your show, and thank you so much for having me here. So let me share my screen and get started here. And now I hope you can see. So before I get into what we're going to talk about more in detail today, just to get a sense of where this is coming from, I wanted to let you know that the talk is going to be mostly based on a research that eventually came out in a book format that is about migration, health, and inequalities, and looks specifically at the case of Ecuadorian migrations, but it was contextualized in the larger setting of Latin American migrations to similar routes, that is to the global north, specifically to the United States and different countries in Europe, and then return migration back to their countries of origin And in this book, we look into the different ways that people's health, both migrants and the relatives of the migrants, health and well-being is affected by migratory processes, and also how it is that people have been dealing with these effects of migration in their health, because it's not that migrants are completely passive or unable to deal with the things, but on the other hand, what they actually do is have a plethora of coping mechanisms to try to move the different obstacles that come, the different ways in which these affect their health. And so the research was done in a way that together, but also health service providers who were working with migrant populations. And we were constantly checking to make sure that the things that we were coming up with resonated and made sense to them. And so the concepts or the ideas that didn't make sense, we either rework them or toss them all together. And the ones that stayed, and I'm going to try to share with you at least the ones that I think are most relevant, stayed in the book and in the different publications, including a website that I'm going to be talking about in a minute, to make sure that we have the most, I guess, reach possible. And you'll notice that the slides are going to be, and you'll see it already in the next slide, in Spanish, because I thought we were going to do this mostly in Spanish, but what we'll do is you will be able to read some of the things in Spanish, but I'll talk about them in English, and then we can move back and forth with the languages. And the first things that I wanted to talk about were related with migration itself, right? Like we tend to have a very limited knowledge about migration, even if we are migrants, right? And also we tend to have a very misrepresented information about what migration is, how many migrants there are, because it's usually it's mostly used in a political way, not just in the United States, but actually in every single country. Migrants tend to be presented as this kind of scapegoats. They are used for political campaigns in different ways. They are feared, they are demonized, they're criminalized, but the reality is very different. And so just to contextualize a very little bit, I'm going to share some numbers, the most recent numbers that you can find nowadays are from 2020. But just to give you a sense that the amount of immigrants, right, people who are migrating internationally, this is not counting people migrating internally, right, but internationally is 281 million. That is 3.6% of the world population. So we're just talking about 3.6% of the entire population are international migrants. Now, when we're looking at forced migration, that is people who are already identified as refugees or internally displaced people, or different types of people who have been forced to move, and now they're counting, for example, people from Venezuela in this particular way. In this last report, we have about 90 million more people. So in total, we have 370 million people who are migrants, either forced or not, right, recognized as forced migrants or not, which is about 4.75% of the entire world population. So we're talking about 5% of the population being migrants. And you can think of this in two ways, right? You can think of this as, all right, you know, like that's a lot of people, but that's also, right, not as many as we may think when we're listening, right, to this narrative that we are being invaded by migrants, right, or that there is a migrant crisis everywhere, right? So the percentages are not that high, and the number of people are not that high either. However, of course, what's happening to them and the situations that push them, right, to move are pretty critical, okay? Now, in terms of the development of, like, let's say, the growth of how many people have been moving, we can see that from 1970 to 2020, in 50 years, we see a growth, but the growth was about 1.3%. So we had 2.3% of the population, now we have 3.6. So again, it grew clearly, right? Like it's a significant growth, but still it's a smaller amount of people, right? It's a small amount of people who are actually going through these processes. Now, where are people going, right? And where are they staying? And what we see here is that in the places where we have the majority of international migrants are these three: North America, Asia, and Europe. And that actually Europe and Asia have higher numbers than international migrants than the US, which of course, if you were listening to the news today, you could never imagine this was the case, right? With this talk about how many people are flooding the US in the border due to the cancellation of Title 42. Again, migration is important. It is in a critical situation, it's not well managed, and we need to pay attention to it. But there's nothing of the order of masses of people invading our countries. Moving on, I just wanted to show these, which are the 20 most important corridors of binational migration. And of course, here we do have something specifically very disproportionately high, right? Which is the corridor between the US and Mexico, right? So the number here is much larger than anywhere else. But just again, to give you a sense, when we're talking about how many migrants, we have about 11 million of migrants who are using these binational corridors in the US and Mexico, followed by República Árabe Syria and Turkey, and I can say in English, Arabic Syria, and then India and the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates comes next, and then from Russia and Ukraine, Russia. There's the list of countries again to give us a little bit of context of where people are going. Another contextualization I wanted to offer had to do with the number of women and men who are migrating. And we see that they are so, right, approximately similar numbers, but we have in 2000, 50% of the migration was by men and 49.4% by women, when we have today is 52% and 47%. And not too much of a difference, but there are a little bit of differences. Now, in terms of how they go through it, changes. Now, the numbers don't change that much. And then the other difference that is important to think about, which is much more telling, is where are the people that are migrating and are working, right? And where they are depending on whether they are men or women, right? So we have in certain countries that there's a majority of male migration, for example, in the Arabic states, right? But in places like North America or in Europe, we have a little bit more of an even split between migrant workers, whether they were men or women. Related to work and migrants are responsible of a very large share of money that is being sent mostly back to their countries of origin. So in 2020, there was 702 million of US dollars in international remittances. And this was a little bit lower than the previous years due to COVID, but not significantly lower as it was expected to be the case. Now, let's move forward and think about how all of this has to do or not with health, okay? When we're thinking about migration and health, usually there's very little that we can find out there related to that topic, because in general, people either study migration or health, and there's very little communication between these two fields, except for certain exceptions that are mostly related with, for example, the International Organization of migration, working together with the World Health Organization. And that just very, very recently, only a few years ago, they started to be more intentional about studying the intersection between migration and health. Before then, most of the care about this topic was done by people who were working in the fields. They were working with migrants and they were seeing how much their health was being affected. And the main area of concentration had to do with refugees, because most refugees are coming from conflict zones, right? From war zones. So there was a better understanding of all the psychological effects that actually the previous time to migrating, right, had brought to them, because they were in places that were in conflict. And then that was still exacerbated by the fact that they had to be forcefully, right, migrating somewhere else. So a lot of the literature had to do with the health of refugees and mostly mental health related issues. That literature is very rich and important, but it's not necessarily applicable to all the other migrants that may be, right, migrating in not such extreme conditions. I don't want to call them normal migrants, but more like migrants who were probably forced to leave because of economic situations. Sometimes, you know, the link between politics and economics that we know is there, but they're not necessarily moving or displaced forcefully because of a conflict or maybe an environmental disaster. So we had to study that better. And the push right now, especially by these main organizations, is to actually think of all of these other migrants that had been really left unattended, right? Now, people in the field, as I was saying, were paying attention to this because they were seeing that migrants were having health issues and they couldn't really tell what was happening to them, right? Like they were trying to find things in the literature, they couldn't really tell exactly what was going on. And then their relatives, people who were relatives of migrants who had not left, who had stayed behind, were also developing different health conditions, right? So the reason why I started looking into this was I was invited to the Instituto de Salud y Migración en Loja, in Ecuador. In Ecuador, they were, you know, had been already witnessing many important waves of out migration and also return migration, internal migration also, but the main focus at that point was external migration, right, and return migration. And they were really concerned because they couldn't really tell what was going on, right? And the health processes were not severe, like strange diseases, which was another focus of migration medicine in another time, right? Which was like, oh, let's look at migrants because they're bringing exotic diseases, right? Or that there's special cases that we need to study, the tropical diseases, they're vectors of illnesses. So it wasn't that, they weren't finding that, they were finding things more related to or closer to post-traumatic stress disorder or other kind of psychosomatic type of processes that they were clearly related with migration, but they weren't to be found or defined anywhere in the literature. So they really wanted to look into this and they invited me. So the first body of literature that was important for us, or the frame of this that we wanted to study, was migration as a social determinant of health, right? So when we think of health, we usually associate health with biology and now genetics. We think of the body, we think of the physical body. Now, more and more, there's more of an understanding that there's also our mental health, and that's there. But there's not so much emphasis on the fact that actually health is social, right? The social determination of health has to do with all the context in which we're living, the environmental conditions in which we're living, which include cultural aspects, social aspects, political aspects, economic inequalities, so on and so forth, and how this, of course, creates better or worse living conditions and better or worse access to health services, and therefore we need to think about health in this social context if we're going to understand how migration affects health, right? So here is a graph, right, that now the World Health Organization or the International Organization of Migration is using to show, right, the different ways in which migration affects health. And migration thought about the conditions that people were living before they migrated, what happens while they're migrating, right? Those trips and those journeys that are becoming increasingly risky and insecure, right? And then what happens once people arrive to the places of destination, right? So before transit and later on the destination, the final destination. And when they're looking at all of these, there are different social conditions, environmental aspects that will affect migrants' health. Okay, so part of these studies that are being now done at an international level, for example, show this kinds of, bring this kind of data. The data about, for instance, if migrants have access to all the services related to health independently from their migratory status, right? Which is a key question. And now we're here talking about this in the US that has a very restrictive health system overall, but also a very restrictive health system related to migrants. And their migratory status change completely whether they can access services or not, or what kinds of services they can access. Unfortunately, the US is not an exception. A lot of countries in the world have a similar restrictive context against migrant health, especially if migrants do not have a regular migratory condition. But then we have exceptions where we have public health systems and more, let's say, welcoming or open policies related to migration and health specifically. So just to give you a sense, between 2018 and 2021, and the countries that they're looking at, they're not revealed anywhere, so I can't really tell you which countries are listed here or not. But what they found is that 50% of those countries, right, so about 42 of those countries have provide access to health services to all migrants independently from their status. Just 42 of those countries, right? Then we have 37% have services available, but only for regular migrants, right? And then we have 8 who have only services that are urgent type of care or emergency services available for migrants, and then 5% no services at all. But remember, we're talking about only 84 of the countries in the world. So we can probably, I don't want to say assume, but maybe consider the possibility that the rest of the countries are not really having too much of an open policy related to migration or health, or else they would have really reported as a, as part of something, I guess, good to share. So related to this, I wanted to get into specifically the findings that we reached in our project. So now let me open that one, and I hope you can see this well. So in our project, as I said earlier, we focused specifically on Ecuadorian migration, but contextualize it, and we can pretty confidently say this applies very well to Latin American migrations to the global north, the United States, and certain countries in Europe specifically. So keeping that in mind also, right, we use different kinds of methodologies to try to gather all of this data to answer the question, how is it that migration is affecting the health of migrants and the relatives that stay behind? And in this website that I'm gonna walk you through it a little bit, and hopefully by the time we finish the conversation, you are curious enough to maybe share some of your experiences, which is completely confidential, and it's just to help us keep, building our collective knowledge about this issue. But for you to think about how all of these, I hope, yes, you are seeing it well. It's me who has to turn to this side. I'm gonna put myself this way. Just to give you a sense that this website was done, of course, in Spanish specifically because of the population we were trying to reach, and we're trying to do all the work required to make it also an English website. But here you can find some information, for example, about why is it that migration affects the physical and mental health of migrants and their relatives that stay behind. And it's all done in a way that hopefully, right, it's very accessible for everyone, right? So one of the things that I wanted to point out here is this idea that migration is a process that puts our health to test, right? That tests our health. And some people think about it as migration as a risk factor, right? But not to get in some of the debate behind whether the idea of risk is fair or not. I think it's useful to think about it as a process also because migrants themselves would describe it that way, right? They would say that migration was not a condition that determined who they were, but it was a process through which they were living, right? So I like this idea of process. And also because it gives us this sense that the different ways in which our health is affected begins before we leave, because we're living, in most cases, conditions that we didn't want to stay living in, right? Whether because there was a generalized political, economic, social crisis, or because you were in one of the groups that was being mostly affected by some of these crises. It's something that also affects us when we are in the process of migration, and as I said earlier, and as we know, and especially you being in a state like New Mexico, that is a border state, right? Like we know that these trips are becoming worse, more threatening, riskier, more expensive, so on and so forth. So although we do have better technologies, and if we compare to other waves of migration and other times where people would come in different conditions, the anti-migratory context and the level of poverty that people are usually escaping, right? Or the critical conditions in which that are forcing them to move, whether they are environmental conditions or political issues, are making these trips very taxing on health. And then the last part of this that is related to what happens once you arrive. And again, unfortunately, we're seeing these trends that are more regressive, I would say, right? Like anti-migrant, xenophobic, racist or different ways of ethnic kind of discrimination coming up. Right-wing politics is rampant, not only in the US, but in many places in the world, and usually comes together with anti-immigrant programs, policies, cultures, environments. So that's happening. Plus the point that no country is exempt of different kinds of social inequalities, racial inequalities, ethnic inequalities, gender inequalities. So all of these are things that migrants will go through because they have to, they arrive somewhere, they have to learn the new ways, and they have to see where they fit in there. And in most cases, they fit very poorly, not because they're unable to fit, but because systemically, right, they're pushed and marginalized in different ways. And also the other portion of this, and I mentioned this earlier, is that the health is social, has to do with how much, when we're thinking about migration, we need to think about active and passive migrants, or that would be like the active migrants are the ones who are taking the journey and leaving, the passive migrants are the ones who are staying. And this population of what we named, right, passive migrants, is usually disregarded, right? Because people are not thinking of them as passive migrants. They're just thinking of them as regular people, right? Whatever they are, citizen, nationals, doesn't matter, resident, but they're just people who didn't go anywhere, right? So what could go wrong with them, right? But of course, there's plenty of things that are happening once they're leaving. And so how is it that health and migration are related? I'm going to start with these that are the health processes themselves. And some of these ideas are related or came out of the small but rich literature that was available for us to think about. And the first idea that I want to talk to you about is building on this idea of grief or mourning. That was one of the bodies, the research that was done related mostly to mental health issues of migrants. The concept was changed a little bit to make it fit better to what we were seeing, but it was inspired by Achotegui's idea of what he called duelo migratorio, just that, migratory mourning. We called it reflexive migratory mourning because what we saw was that migrants were not just grieving, right? Like they weren't just in mourning because they had left their country or their people or their culture, but they were also reevaluating everything that happened in their life and what was coming next. So it was this kind of like putting things in perspective. And to give you a quote, and this time I will read it in Spanish and then I'll translate it. I can just, illustrates this idea very well. It says, al principio, uno atraviesa un proceso de duelo. La soledad se siente intensamente. Es un proceso personal de duelo por todo lo que uno ha dejado atrás, su familia, su tierra, su idioma, la cultura, la comida. Cuando uno se va lejos del lugar donde siempre ha vivido, es como que algo se muere dentro de uno. Pero al migrar, algo nuevo nace. So at the beginning, one goes through a grief process, right? A grieving process. Solitude is very intense. It's a personal process that one has to go through because of everything that one left behind, its family, its land, the language, the culture, the food. When one goes far away from where one was born, it's like something dies inside of you. But also when one migrates, something new is born. So this process of grief, of duelo, happens to all passive and active migrants. Okay? Everybody goes through this because you have to adapt to this new moment in your life, right? You have to adjust, adapt, or learn, understand this moment in your life. And people go through this in a way that is very painful and is very emotional in different ways, but it's also a chance to kind of start anew in different fashions. So another important and more, taxing process that happens has to do with the trauma that is proper to migratory processes. No matter how beautiful your migration was, it is a traumatizing process, right? And both active migrants and passive migrants go through it. I'm going to just talk about this one for a minute. And if I hope you can see the drawings if you're watching this somewhere, because these drawings speak much better than any of the words that I can bring up. Maybe I can make it bigger if I can. Hopefully you can see it, right? And here you have a migrant, right, with her hand on her head, like maybe it's like a headache that she's having or something like that, talking to a doctor, and the doctor is prescribing medicine. But what she's thinking about is her family, right? Because what happens is that migratory processes can be very traumatizing because of the difficulties that people lived before migrating, the ones that they may have gone through when they migrated, right? When they were in transit, and then everything that happens to them once they arrive, regardless of how beautiful their arrival and the place where they're going to is. It's a difficult process, right? And again, here, what I'll say, I guess I'll share a quote again, because I think they speak much better than any explanations, right? And Carmen, I'm going to try to translate as I'm reading, okay? She says, to be able to pay the debt that I had, because I had to borrow money to be able to migrate, and also to be able to send money back home, I had to work as a domestic worker for 3 years. But that type of job drives you nuts. To be locked in a house every day, working nonstop. I didn't have my residence. I couldn't really work in my own profession. I was a nurse. So how could I explain it? I was a little bit depressed. I didn't feel desire or wish to do anything at all. And this was Carmen, who was a person who had moved, was a nurse. She moved from Ecuador to Spain. And despite that, there were good migratory, let's say, policies between Ecuador and Spain. Not everybody that left in a regular way. The process was very complicated, and many people were living irregularly for several years before they could regularize. So in most cases, people were really having very hard time. Not as bad time as they had in the US, but still a pretty bad time, regardless of the policies that were there. And just to give you a sense, and I'm not gonna explain every step of the way, but here again, I hope you can see this drawing and what happened with the children. But this not only affecting children, it affects spouses, it affects parents of people who left, and how they process that departure, right? And here again, I'm gonna share a quote, one that maybe is not that long. And here Rita says, mi hijo mayor migró al exterior porque me quedé viuda. My oldest son migrated abroad because I was a widow. Emotionally, this affected us very much, because as a result of her departure, I developed arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis. And that was because I was very depressed. It affected me very much, and it continues to affect me till today, 14 years later. It is something terrible. That's just an example of how traumatizing, again, migration can be. I'm going to talk about stress now, migratory stress, and then I'm going to move into the different ways in which people cope with all of these processes, because none of this becomes so overwhelming in general that people cannot move forward with their lives, but they have to go through that, right? Remember that word, process. So if we're talking about migratory stress here, we're building again in some of the literature there. And migrating is stressful, period. And I don't think anybody needs a lot of explanation about it. It's stressful not to know where you're going. It's stressful not to know what kind of job you're gonna have. It's stressful not to know when you can return. If you can return, it's stressful to understand that all of a sudden maybe you're being discriminated because of the color of your skin or the language that you spoke since you were a child. It's very stressful, right? So when we're looking at stress in migrants specifically, we are checking for a kind of a set of symptoms, right? That include sadness, crying, suicidal thoughts, tension, insomnia, nightmares, repetitive or recurrent thinking or thoughts, irritability, nervousness, confusion, distraction, fatigue, pain, and body aches, migraine, changes in appetite and weight. And what we see when we're looking at all of this is that absolutely every single person went through migratory stress, right? Of course, migratory stress on its own is not gonna kill anybody, but the problem is that people don't really pay attention to how they don't pay attention to their health. And it's gonna bring me to the next concept that I wanted to bring up, which is very important related to health, which is this idea of normalizing your ill-being, your malaise, right? In Espanol, we say normalización del malestar. Migrants get so used to feeling bad and to having all kinds of pains and aches and feeling down and being depressed and crying and not having faith or having, you know, much desire to move forward. Plus, they tend to have very limited conditions economically. They're always tight, at least for the very first years, right? Even some of them eventually, you know, get ahead and can do well economically, but the first few years are really difficult, right? Whether they are regular or irregular migrants, right? And economically, they're tight, and also depending on where they were, they will. Third part of this that is trees, right? When you have anti-migration environments, you may have policies that are pushing for doctors or health service providers to work together with police or migration officers to find people who may have irregular situations. So people are very fearful, and that's not because they're ignorant, it's because they know exactly how risky it is in different situations to just reveal, right, their personal information to be able to get access to healthcare. So what do? They normalize their malaise. They normalize their ill-being. So for example, right, these are the kinds of health conditions that people typically normalize, whether they are migrants that are active or passive migrants, right? Number one is to have a deteriorated health and an unstable health condition. That's totally normal. Nobody questions that their health goes up and down and that they are generally feeling pretty bad, right? Their good is pretty bad, right? And these are the kinds of things that they think are completely normal, not to be concerned with. Physical weakness, tiredness, body aches, muscular aches, articulares, the joint aches, arthritis, migraine, different kind of breathing or pulmonary type of problems, right? Allergies, different kinds of allergies and asthma and recurrent flus and recurrent things like that, right? Gastritis, colitis, ulcers, diabetes, hypertension, cholesterol changes, right? Hormonal imbalances, menstrual anomalies, right? And also, of course, changes of appetite and weight, different issues with the skin, different eruptions in the skin, alopecia, varicosis, and also on the more, I guess, like emotional, psychological side, changes of mood or mood changes, frequent crises, kind of in emotional kind of going down or deterioration, nervousness, anxiety, insomnia, constant sadness, anguish, depression. I mean, all of these, again, none will make you break, but the systematic, right, disregard for these recurrent and frequent conditions creates issues that could have been treated and could have been addressed earlier on, right? And tied to this, what we have is what we call Salud Migrante Denegada, which is denied migrant health. And this has to do with the fact that we normalize malaise and then we don't treat it at all, right? So here we have a little bit of numbers from the research that we did, specifically with the sample that we did, right? So for example, to the question of when you felt bad, weak or ill, what did you do, right? So they had to check all the ones that they would do. So 47%, the green are the active migrants. Let's focus on them first, right? 47% of active migrants went to a doctor, but 53% did not, right? 23% went to emergency rooms. 23% talked to relatives, friends, or people they knew. And 18% did nothing, waited until it went away. And then when we're looking at passive migrants, we have that 22% only went to a doctor, even lower, right? Because this idea they're passive migrants, that something could be happening to them, is not crossing anybody's mind, right? 4% went to emergency room, 20% talked to relatives, friends, etc. 19% did nothing, waited until it went away. And this, of course, tells you very much, and tells you also from the perspective of those who are providing health services, what's going on, because they don't, let's say, catch, right, these problems when they are treatable, or when they're, when it's the right time to deal with them. They're always catching this basically when things got to the edge, right, to the extreme. And when things got to the extreme, migrants did go to the doctor because that was, unavoidable. But all the time in between, right, nothing happened. Okay, so I could read one more quote, but I think that probably it would be better to move on to something else, or especially leave time for questions and comments and just open conversation. There's a lot of processes here. There's a lot of things that are interesting to learn about, and hopefully you find this useful as well. So let me just now stop sharing the screen for a minute and get back to you, so you can we can open the conversation.
Thank you so much, Roberta. That was so that's amazing. If you could put the link maybe in the chat, we could share that out so that our audience, and later on we can go ahead and attach that link to this film. So if people want to look at it later on and review it, or have questions, or want to share their stories on there. So this makes me think about a lot of the latent illnesses that happen. For example, I just returned from a data summit on cancer, and it was showing how most people don't diagnose until the very end, so stage 4. And so you're kind of seeing these same trends that are, end stage or things like this. And I'm just thinking from a perspective of intervention. You showed us some really critical areas of where, health intervention would be critical. How do we, in your mind, how do we do that? What could we create as a safety net? During COVID, we had guests and others that shared, even teachers, right? Educators, they were going through these things, and unable to get resources to families, unable to get healthcare during COVID, isolation, the language, lots of language barriers. So I'm just thinking now, post that, how do we create interventions that we can catch and support? Because many times we don't know, their experience or the lived experience before somebody migrates, or, between, or the family.
So yeah, thank you for that question. I think that, I think it's important to start by making sure that people who are providing health services get a little bit of training about health and migration, because that's usually lacking, even if they're working with migrant populations, even when they're working with migrant populations, right? And the opposite, there's a lot of service providers with, in general, for migrants, like migrant advocates, right? Like that never ever thought about health and migration either. So we need to make sure that people who are working with migrant populations, wherever it is that they are getting and being in contact with them, have at least this kind of basic training where they become aware, right, of how these two are connected always. It's not just when things were really bad that all of this is happening. Things could have gone pretty decently, and you would still go through a lot of these processes, right? Now, the other thing has to do with how to reach and make sure that this information is available and well learned, right? And also developed by the migrants themselves. So one of the things that we were able to get to through this research project that ended up, you know, lasting about 7 years, right, of fieldwork and contact with migrants and surveys and interviews and community workshops and trainings and focus groups, all kinds of things with it, right, was that many of them were like, oh, now I understand what happened to me, right? Like it was kind of like being able to identify something was helping them also process it, was helping them think of what they had gone through in a way that was not shameful, because they didn't think they had to hide what was happening to them. It was important that they realized that they were not abnormal or unique, but that this was something completely common, right? So I think this kind of, I guess, informational or knowledge campaigns, I'm not sure what's the best term for that, with people who are migrating, with people who have relatives who are migrants, are very important, right? To kind of is to give some language to what's happening to them. And here, you know, like when I started this project, and, you know, was part of the reason why I was invited, because they were saying, we can't find in the literature much about what's happening, right? We had identified, after lots of, you know, looking for different information, 6 health processes that people were talking about. And then at the end of the project, right, we have developed all of these tools, right? All of this, I think I like to think of them as tools, because it's like, how can we, you know, conceptualize what's happening already? We didn't invent any of these, right? When we talked about, for example, how nostalgia can be paralyzing, people were going through this. They never thought about it. So we put a name, right? We conceptualize it, we identify that. And I think that can help us, right? In many ways, I find this process very similar to when, for example, we went through, you know, the women's movement related with gender violence, and started putting, you know, labels and understanding and conceptualizing and theorizing. And that helped a lot of people realize, oh, I am in an abusive relation, or, oh, this is what's happening to me, right? So there's some of that needs to get done as well, to have like a larger conscience of this is what could happen to people who migrate, and it's completely normal.
Thank you so much, Roberta, for sharing that information. And with 1 in 10 New Mexicans being migrants themselves, and 70% of migrants in New Mexico are from Mexico, is there something in your experience or within your knowledge that we can, I guess, kind of hold close to us as we're working with our population here in Bernalillo County? Is there something that we specifically need to be sensitive to about the experience of migrants coming from our southern border?
Sure. So I think that there's several issues, right? Like one is that they are really going through a border that is increasingly militarized, very risky. So the chance that they had a very traumatizing travel, right, journey is very high. It's not just kind of, oh, I guess I may think you may have had a difficult trip. Probably they did. Most probably they did, right? Or they know somebody who went through something very terrible, or that they didn't even make it, right? They didn't go, they weren't able to actually finish the journey. So that's one, right? It's a fact, right? The other thing is that I think it's very important that when we approach migrants, we recognize them fully with all of their agency. Right? So migrants they are the protagonists of this. They have agency. They're very courageous. They're wise. They are pretty rational. Nobody just leaves because they didn't know what they wanted to do with their life, and they go through all of these, like, just because. The people are very strategic in the good sense, right? Strategic in the way that they really thought about it, that they have what we call these transgenerational goals. Migration may be an individual moving, but it's a family, right? It's a community that's actually migrating. They are migrating so they can help people who are older than them in their family and extended family and kin, and also the ones that are coming, the next generation. So they have that very clear in their mind, and because of that, they put up with a lot of things, right? Because they want to make sure that they can achieve that goal. So I think it's important that when we approach a migrant, yes, we understand that they may have been victimized and that they can be traumatized and they are going through a difficult moment, but they are 100% a full person that you can interact perfectly well with, right? And they can decide and think on their own and move forward.
I know we have a few more minutes left, but do we have any questions from our audience? I know we have a few individuals joining us on Zoom. I want to open it up.
I had a question. I had two questions. I'm Cecilia Portal from Valley Community Interpreters in Albuquerque. How do you define regular and irregular immigrants? Was the first question. And the second question is, how did you incorporate in your research language access? Because language really impacts health outcomes, and it has a huge impact in individuals' lives when they migrate. Thank you.
Absolutely. So irregular would be what some people say would be undocumented. That's just like one of the terms that is being used, I guess, in migration literature to avoid the undocumented portion of it, because people have their own documents, just they do not have a regular migratory status in the country they went to. That's basically the difference. And then in terms of language, yes, we did approach that, right? And that was part of the interesting aspect of comparing the US and Spain with Ecuadorian migrants, because in Spain, they didn't have necessarily the language barriers that they could have in the US, unless they went to places like Barcelona or Catalonia or the País Vasco, where they had to, learn a different dialect and a different language all over again. So language was an issue, and it was something that most migrants talked about as being one of the reasons why they wouldn't go seek services if they were feeling ill, or that they didn't know how to do things because they had that language barrier. Many people talk about the importance of learning the language to be able to overcome those obstacles, and how different their experience was once they were able to speak better the language. Also critical to have translation services available, right, in the different locations where they would find especially health services or look for health services. But also what we found in the research was that in the situations where they did have the language accessibility, whether because there was interpretation or because they knew the language, all of these other processes that were kind of challenging them to go through their healthcare stayed. They were there still, right? So language was a barrier, but it was not the main barrier for many of them. Like a little bit would be like other things had weighed more, right? They were more constraining than language. And so it was a little bit surprising for us when we found that, because we thought language was going to be the one main difference. But then many people who had that barrier, you know, resolved, or it wasn't there, they still had, you know, their trauma, their grief, their paralyzing, you know, nostalgia, and the different things that we found, right, that were kind of preventing them from doing better or feeling better. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Is there anybody else on that would like to ask a question? I know we're right at time. You can also put your questions in the chat, or if you'd like more information, we will have Roberta's information on this, as well as her website, so that you can take a look at some of the other works that she's done. There's a lot of work around violence against immigrant women, Latino women. There's a lot of different information, and I wish we had all day to talk with you, Roberta, because there's so much here, and it's so critical to the lives of all the individuals that we interact with, that are part of our community, and that are part of our land and our Querencia, right? And so we see how Querencia is really important to all of those that migrate, and we can understand how important land and home and homeland and family, and how critical that is, and such a central part to health. So we want to thank everyone for joining us today. And special thanks to, thank you so much, Roberta, for being here, taking the time to talk to everyone here. And I hope that we can bring you out in the future to do some more talks here in New Mexico. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roberta. It was so lovely speaking with you, and thank you for sharing the information with us. And thank you everyone for joining us.
So we will be talking about maternal health outcomes. So please join us in a few weeks in June. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.